Condemned by the rigid Hollywood machine as a liability and found surrounded by the grim remnants of addiction on a cold floor, Blake Heron was dismissed as just another tragic statistic. Followed by a state of complete isolation, his final days were stripped of all former glory. Yet 2 decades earlier, he was celebrated across the globe, universally adored as the angelic face of childhood innocence, who heroically saved a dog in the 1996 blockbuster Shiloh. What unspeakable horror drives a beloved global icon from the blinding lights of a red carpet to dying completely alone in the shadows? The machinery that would eventually destroy him was set in motion 2 decades earlier. The premiere of a Hollywood film in the mid-90s was not merely a celebration of artistic achievement. It was a highly orchestrated corporate coronation, a meticulously designed spectacle intended to maximize the return on a multi-million-dollar investment. When Shiloh was released to the public in 1996, the industry did not just release a movie, it unleashed a carefully calibrated, emotional weapon upon the global market. At the center of this relentless media frenzy stood Blake Heron, a 14-year-old boy who had just been transformed from a private citizen into a publicly traded commodity. The reviews poured in, universally praising his performance, calling him a revelation, a natural, a prodigy of empathy who possessed an emotional depth far beyond his years. The box office receipts swelled, validating the studio's gamble. But this avalanche of adulation masked a terrifying underlying reality. Blake had not just succeeded at a job, he had successfully surrendered his own developing identity to the machinery of the entertainment complex. He was no longer just a boy from Sherman Oaks, California. He was now officially intellectual property. The audience looked at the screen and saw a heartwarming narrative of a boy saving a dog. But the executives in the towering glass boardrooms of Los Angeles looked at the exact same screen and saw a highly efficient, remarkably low-maintenance revenue stream. The praise that was heaped upon his young shoulders was not the unconditional love of a parent. It was the conditional, transactional approval of a factory foreman praising a machine that is operating at peak efficiency. Behind the romanticized mythology, a 1990s film set was far from a magical playground. It was a chaotic, high-stress, fiercely regimented industrial workplace where time literally equated to tens of thousands of dollars per hour. In this environment, a child is not treated as a developing human being who requires patience, play, and psychological safety. The child is the central cog in a massive financial apparatus. If the cog jams, the entire factory grinds to a halt. When Blake Heron stepped onto the set of Shiloh, he was stepping into a pressure cooker of adult expectations. He was subjected to a grueling daily schedule that would break the spirit of most seasoned professionals. He was required to wake up before dawn. He sat rigidly in a makeup chair while adults applied compounds to perfect his on-screen appeal. Then he stood under the blistering, unforgiving heat of cinematic lighting arrays for hours on end. He was expected to hit his marks with mathematical precision and remember complex dialogue. He had to do this while surrounded by dozens of stressed, exhausted crew members. These were adults whose own livelihoods depended entirely on a 14-year-old boy's ability to perform. The child labor laws of the era mandated the presence of a studio teacher and mandated breaks, but these were largely legal fictions, bureaucratic boxes to be ticked to satisfy the state, rather than genuine protections of the child's well-being. Education on a film set is a fractured, disjointed farce, squeezed into 15-minute intervals between lighting setups, teaching a child that intellectual development is always strictly secondary to the daily shot list. The physical exhaustion, however, was merely a precursor to the far more devastating psychological extraction required by the job. The role of Marty Preston in Shiloh was not a light-hearted comedic romp. It was a deeply emotional, dramatic performance that required the actor to project intense fear, profound sadness, and righteous anger. How does an adult director elicit these complex, adult emotions from a 14-year-old boy? They do not do it through academic discussion. They do it through emotional strip mining. The director must bypass the child's natural psychological defenses and tap directly into their real, unprotected insecurities. To make the audience cry, Blake Heron was required to break his own heart on cue 50 times a day from different camera angles. He was praised, rewarded, and financially compensated for his ability to summon genuine psychological pain and display it for the consumption of the camera lens. This creates a deeply toxic neurological feedback loop. The child learns that his vulnerability is his greatest financial asset. He learns that his tears are currency. He is taught to weaponize his own empathy, to turn his internal emotional landscape inside out, leaving him hollowed out, exhausted, and fundamentally detached from his own feelings once the director yells, "Cut." The industry demands that child actors live in a constant vibrating state of emotional hyperarousal, blurring the lines between the character's fictional trauma and the child's actual reality. Blake was not acting out the trauma of losing a dog. He was manifesting real physiological stress responses, elevating his cortisol levels and flooding his young nervous system with panic, all to ensure that the studio's product achieved maximum emotional resonance with the target demographic. When the grueling months of filming finally concluded, the exploitation simply shifted from the sound stage to the marketing department. The press tour for a major motion picture is an assembly line of repetitive, superficial interactions designed to sell the product to the masses. Blake was paraded through an endless gauntlet of talk shows, radio interviews, and magazine photo shoots. He was required to sit in hotel suites for days on end, answering the exact same inane questions from hundreds of different journalists, always maintaining the bright, polite, enthusiastic facade of the perfect Hollywood child. He was trained to deliver focus group-tested sound bites, to smile until his facial muscles cramped, and to project an image of effortless charm. This performative existence is a uniquely isolating form of torture. The child realizes that the people interviewing him, the fans screaming his name and the executives shaking his hand, do not actually see him. They see the character. They see Marty Preston. They see the marketable illusion of innocence. Blake Heron, the actual human boy with his own unique fears, desires, and complexities, was effectively erased, overwritten by the brand identity constructed by the studio's public relations team. He became a prisoner of his own success, trapped inside a glossy two-dimensional persona that he was contractually obligated to maintain at all times. This total absorption into the corporate machinery inevitably triggered a catastrophic collapse of the normal family hierarchy. In a healthy domestic environment, parents provide boundaries, protection, and unconditional love, shielding the child from the harsh realities of the economic world. But when a 14-year-old boy becomes the primary economic engine of his entire family, generating more income in a single week than his parents might earn in a decade, the traditional power dynamic is violently inverted. The parents morph from guardians into middle management. They become reliant on the child's continued success to maintain their newfound standard of living. their mortgage, and their social status. This creates a suffocating, unspoken pressure on the child. Blake was no longer just acting for his own enjoyment or artistic fulfillment. He was carrying the financial survival of his family on his back. If he decided he was tired, if he decided he wanted to quit acting and just be a normal teenager, the entire economic structure built around him would collapse. He was effectively robbed of the right to fail, the right to rebel, and the right to simply be an unremarkable developing adolescent. He was a corporate CEO, trapped in a teenager's body, bearing adult responsibilities without the emotional maturity or the legal autonomy to process them. The unconditional love of the family unit becomes inherently corrupted by the transactional nature of the industry, leaving the child with a terrifying subconscious realization that affection and approval are directly tied to box office performance. The isolation that accompanies this bizarre existence is absolute and impenetrable. While Blake's peers in the real world were navigating the universal grounding experiences of adolescence, going to football games, dealing with first crushes, failing algebra, and figuring out who they wanted to be, Blake was existing in a hermetically sealed bubble of adult sycophants and industry handlers. He could not relate to normal teenagers because his reality was entirely alien to theirs. He could not complain about the exhaustion of a 12-hour workday or the anxiety of a contract negotiation to a classmate who was worried about a history pop quiz. The wealth and fame that the public perceives as the ultimate privilege actually operate as an invisible, impenetrable wall, cutting the child's star off from the essential, grounding social interactions that build empathy and a stable sense of self. He was surrounded by hundreds of people on a daily basis, yet he was profoundly, existentially alone. His social circle was restricted to other child actors who were themselves deeply traumatized and highly competitive, or to adults who were paid to tolerate him. He was denied the fundamental human right to anonymity, the right to make mistakes in private, and the right to grow up without an audience dissecting his every awkward phase. As the phenomenal success of Shiloh cemented his status as a premier child star, a darker, far more terrifying shadow began to creep across his horizon. The industry had crowned him a king, but it was a kingdom built entirely on the fragile, temporary foundation of his prepubescent aesthetic. In the ordinary world, puberty is a necessary bridge to adulthood. In Hollywood, it is a biological expiration date. For Blake, transitioning from the cherubic savior of Shiloh into a developing young man wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a professional death sentence. The industry deals in static illusions, and the archetype of the innocent child shatters the moment a jawline broadens or a voice drops. The executives, who once calculated the merchandising value of his earnest smile, had no use for the teenager he was becoming. The shift in his reality was not announced with a formal letter of termination. It manifested as a sudden, deafening silence. The audition requests, which had once flooded his agent's desk, began to slow to a trickle before drying up almost entirely. When he did walk into casting rooms, the atmosphere had fundamentally altered. The casting directors no longer looked at him with the warm, maternal indulgence reserved for the cute kid. They looked at him with a clinical, calculating detachment, trying to figure out where a former child star fit into the rigid demographics of teen cinema. He was too old to play the innocent son, but he carried too much childhood baggage to seamlessly transition into the rugged, leading man roles. He was trapped in the cinematic uncanny valley, a transitional space where the industry simply did not know what to do with him. This rejection is not merely a loss of employment, it is a profound existential erasure. For a young man whose entire sense of self-worth, whose family's financial stability, and whose daily routine had been dictated by his ability to please a camera since he was a preteen, the sudden realization that he was no longer wanted created a psychological wound of unimaginable proportions. He was forced to confront the horrifying truth that the global adoration he had experienced was never actually about him, Blake Heron, the human being. It was entirely about the temporary, marketable arrangement of his facial features. Blake Heron's unraveling was not an isolated anomaly. The blueprint for his destruction had been drawn decades earlier, written in the blood of the first generation of television child stars. In 1990, just years before Blake stepped onto the set of Shiloh, former 1950s child icon Rusty Hamer shot himself in the head after enduring the exact same cycle of exploitation, obsolescence, and addiction. His highly publicized suicide sent shockwaves through the industry, proving that treating children as disposable commodities was a fatal practice. The most damning aspect of Blake Heron's story is the timeline. Hollywood executives had all the historical data, the psychological profiling, and the undeniable evidence of the harm they were causing. The echoes of Rusty Hamer's gunshot had barely faded. They knew exactly what happened to child stars who were chewed up and spat out. Yet, they placed a 14-year-old Blake Heron into the exact same centrifuge of exploitation without a single meaningful safeguard, knowing full well they were setting him up for a catastrophic fall the moment he outgrew his usefulness. Blake was not a victim of an unforeseen tragedy. He was the predictable byproduct of a system operating exactly as it was designed to operate. He was walking the exact same path that Rusty Hamer had walked, a path that the studios had paved, illuminated, and continued to maintain, despite knowing that it ended at the edge of a cliff. As the late 90s bled into the early 2000s, Blake found himself standing at the edge of that very precipice. The transition from the celebrated star of a beloved family film to a struggling, unemployed young adult was jarring and violent. The financial reality of his family, which had grown accustomed to the income generated by his childhood labor, suddenly became precarious, adding a layer of suffocating guilt and anxiety to his already fragile mental state. He was a teenager carrying the financial expectations of an adult without the earning power to sustain them. The phone did ring occasionally. He secured minor roles in films like We Were Soldiers, in 2002 and 11-14, in 2003. However, these were no longer the leading heroic parts. For a young man accustomed to carrying a global blockbuster, this shift felt profound. He was navigating a transitional space, trying to find his footing in an industry that remembered him primarily as a child. Every audition he failed to book, every rejection from a casting director, and every month that passed without a significant paycheck was a hammer blow to his developing sense of self-worth. He was being forced to learn, in the most brutal public manner possible, that his value in the world was entirely conditional. He was not loved for who he was. He had been loved for what he represented, and what he represented was gone forever. The psychological terrain of a discarded child star is a uniquely terrifying landscape, a wasteland of distorted memories and shattered expectations. Blake was forced to live with the ghost of his younger self, constantly confronted by the image of the boy who saved Shiloh on television reruns and VHS covers. He was haunted by a version of himself that was universally adored, a version of himself that he could never resurrect. The cognitive dissonance of knowing that you peaked at the age of 14, that the greatest achievement of your life is already behind you before you have even graduated high school, creates a profound existential despair. The silence of his phone was not just a lack of employment. It was a loud, continuous confirmation of his own worthlessness. He was staring into a void of irrelevance, facing the terrifying prospect of living the next 50 years of his life as a footnote in Hollywood history, a whatever happened to trivia question. The industry had carefully constructed a magnificent, towering pedestal for him to stand upon, and then, without warning, they had simply removed it, leaving him to freefall in the dark. In this terrifying, solitary descent, surrounded by the ruins of his own childhood and the crushing weight of his obsolescence, the mind desperately seeks a parachute, an anesthetic, a way to survive the impact. And it was in this dark, desperate freefall, long before he hit the ground, that the seeds of a far more sinister and deadly coping mechanism began to take root in the fertile soil of his trauma. The psychological freefall of a discarded child star is not a sudden, dramatic plunge into the abyss. Rather, it is a slow, agonizing descent through layers of increasing isolation, a quiet unraveling that occurs entirely out of the public eye. When the machinery of Hollywood abruptly stops validating a young person's existence, the sudden absence of noise creates a terrifying vacuum in the developing mind, a void that frantically demands to be filled. For Blake Heron, the transition from the universally adored cinematic savior of Shiloh to a forgotten, unemployed teenager was a trauma of such profound magnitude that his young nervous system simply lacked the architectural capacity to process it. He was a boy who had been trained, praised, and highly compensated for his ability to feel intensely, to open up his emotional core for the camera, but he had never been taught how to close those wounds once the director yelled "cut." Left to navigate the bruising reality of his own obsolescence, Blake did what countless traumatized, overwhelmed individuals have done throughout history. He sought an anesthetic. The narrative surrounding child stars who fall into addiction is often framed by the media as a moral failing, a story of a privileged, rebellious youth who threw away a golden opportunity in pursuit of hedonistic thrills. This is a deliberate, cynical mischaracterization propagated by an industry desperate to absolve itself of any responsibility. Blake Heron did not turn to narcotics because he was a thrill seeker looking for a party. He turned to narcotics because he was a deeply wounded, exhausted child desperately searching for an off switch. The genesis of his substance abuse did not begin in the grim, desperate years of his adulthood. It began when he was merely 12 years old, navigating the blistering, high-pressure environment of professional acting before he was even legally old enough to drive a car. At 12, an age when the brain is highly plastic and deeply vulnerable to external stress, Blake was introduced to the normalizing culture of substance use that permeates the adult-dominated world of Hollywood sets and industry parties. In an ecosystem where adult professionals routinely use alcohol, prescription pills, and illicit substances to manage the grueling hours and intense anxieties of film production, a child is implicitly taught that chemical regulation is a standard occupational tool. The initial introduction to marijuana and alcohol likely served as a simple, effective pressure valve, a way to artificially lower the cortisol levels that had been permanently elevated by the demands of his career. These substances provided a temporary soft focus blur over the sharp, terrifying edges of his reality, offering a few hours of artificial peace where he did not have to worry about hitting his marks, memorizing lines, or carrying the financial weight of his family's expectations. But the insidious nature of self-medication is that it requires ever-increasing dosages to achieve the same baseline of numbness, particularly when the underlying source of the pain is not only untreated but actively expanding. As Blake grew older and the industry began its systematic withdrawal of affection, the anxiety of performing was brutally replaced by the suffocating despair of being ignored. The soft drugs that had once taken the edge off the pressure were entirely insufficient to numb the profound existential agony of rejection. Every failed audition, every unanswered phone call from his agent, and every time he looked in the mirror and saw the unmarketable features of adulthood replacing the lucrative innocence of his childhood, the internal pain amplified into a deafening roar. To silence a roar of that magnitude, a person requires a much heavier, much darker instrument of suppression. This is the precise, devastating juncture at which heroin entered the narrative of Blake Heron's life. Heroin is not a social drug. It is not a substance used to enhance the vibrant experiences of life or to connect with others on a dance floor. Heroin is the ultimate isolator, a chemical sledgehammer that fundamentally uncouples the mind from the physical and emotional realities of the body. It wraps the user in a heavy, impenetrable blanket of synthetic apathy, slowing the heart rate, depressing the respiratory system, and completely obliterating the brain's capacity to process grief, anxiety, or shame. For a young man who felt as though he was constantly failing to meet the expectations of his past, heroin offered the seductive, deadly promise of absolute nothingness. It erased the crushing dichotomy between Blake Heron, the struggling adult, and Marty Preston, the immortal child hero. When the heroin flooded his receptors, the studio executives, the disappointed casting directors, and the ghosts of his own former glory simply ceased to exist. He was no longer the boy who saved the dog. He was no longer the actor who couldn't get a job. He was just a warm, floating consciousness, detached from the horrific burden of his own identity. The tragedy of this chemical surrender is compounded by the staggering, willful blindness of the entertainment industry that surrounded him. Hollywood is a small, insular community where secrets are rare, and the physical deterioration of a former star is quickly noticed. Yet the machinery of the business operates on a code of transactional omerta. As long as a child actor's destructive behavior does not disrupt the shooting schedule, inflate the insurance premiums, or generate negative press that threatens box office returns, the adults in the room will look the other way with a chilling, practiced efficiency. The industry possesses an army of managers, agents, publicists, and studio executives who are paid handsomely to monitor every aspect of a young star's life, from their diet to their wardrobe. Yet this vast network of supervision miraculously evaporates the moment the child begins to self-destruct. They did not intervene when a teenage Blake began to exhibit the classic, undeniable signs of substance dependency, because intervening would require acknowledging their own complicity in the creation of his trauma. It is far easier and infinitely more profitable to compartmentalize a young actor's addiction as a personal tragedy rather than an industrial disease. The studio heads who had happily cashed the checks generated by Blake's tears in Shiloh felt no moral obligation to fund his psychological recovery when those tears turned into a heroin dependency. They viewed him not as a human being in crisis, but as a depreciated asset that had already been fully amortized. This callous abandonment reinforces the deepest, most destructive fear of the child star, the belief that they possess no inherent human worth outside of their ability to entertain. Left entirely to his own devices, without a functional support system or the financial resources to access long-term dual diagnosis psychiatric care, Blake was trapped in a solitary confinement of his own making, locked inside a cycle of addiction that was fueled by the very industry that now refused to acknowledge his existence. The boy who had so masterfully projected empathy onto the silver screen was now drowning in a world utterly devoid of it, forced to rely on a syringe to provide the comforts and protection that the adults in his life had catastrophically failed to deliver. As the years bled into one another, the heroine ceased to be a tool for escaping his reality and instead became the entirety of his reality, fundamentally rewiring his neurochemistry and setting the stage for a physical deterioration so profound and heartbreaking that it would eventually eclipse the cinematic legacy he had sacrificed his childhood to build. The physical manifestation of this chemical surrender is not an instantaneous event, but rather a grueling, multi-decade process of biological erosion, a slow-motion destruction of the very aesthetic assets that Hollywood had once so aggressively monetized. For over 20 years, the relentless cycle of heroin addiction systematically dismantled the architecture of Blake Heron's body, transforming the vibrant, universally recognizable face of a cinematic icon into a harrowing cartography of pharmaceutical dependency. In the public imagination, heavily influenced by the sanitized narratives of cinematic tragedy, drug addiction is often romanticized as a tragic, almost glamorous flaw of the tortured artist, a temporary stumble on the path to an inevitable triumphant comeback. The physiological reality of long-term intravenous opioid abuse, however, is entirely devoid of romance. It is a brutal, unforgiving war of attrition waged against the human immune system, the vascular network, and the cellular integrity of the body. Heroin is a profoundly selfish pathogen that hijacks the body's metabolic processes, suppressing the appetite, disrupting the natural rhythms of sleep, and relentlessly degrading the internal organs. As the years bled into decades, the boy whose cherubic, unblemished features had once commanded millions of dollars at the global box office began to visually evaporate. His frame, once radiating the boundless kinetic energy of adolescence, became increasingly gaunt and frail, the muscle mass cannibalized by a body that was constantly starving for nutrients while simultaneously battling the toxic load of illicit narcotics. The skin, deprived of hydration and essential vitamins, took on a pallid grayish hue, losing the vital elasticity of youth and stretching tightly over the underlying bone structure. The bright, expressive eyes that had so masterfully conveyed the righteous innocence of Marty Preston retreated deep into their sockets, perpetually shadowed by the dark, heavy fatigue of chronic withdrawal and chemical saturation. This physical unraveling is a uniquely cruel punishment for a former child star, an individual whose entire psychological foundation and economic viability had been constructed entirely upon the perceived perfection of their physical appearance. Every time Blake looked into a mirror, he was not merely confronting the ravaging effects of a deadly disease. He was witnessing the undeniable, terrifying destruction of his own market value, a daily, inescapable reminder that the industry that had once worshipped his image would now recoil from it in horror. This physical deterioration precipitated a devastating shift in his social environment, transforming the glittering, sycophantic world of Hollywood into a barren landscape of isolation and active avoidance. The entertainment industry, a business completely obsessed with the projection of vitality, youth, and success, treats the visibly addicted not as human beings in need of profound medical intervention, but as dangerous, contagious liabilities. The agents, managers, and publicists who had once fiercely competed to represent the young star, who had happily skimmed their lucrative percentages from his childhood labor, vanished with breathtaking speed the moment the heroine began to visibly eclipse his potential for future earnings. Blake was no longer invited to the exclusive industry events, the premiere parties, or the casting rooms. He was effectively quarantined, excised from the social registry of the entertainment complex to ensure that his messy, unphotogenic reality did not contaminate the pristine, highly curated brands of his former colleagues. The people who had once enthusiastically praised his natural talent now crossed the street to avoid him, whispering about his demise in hushed, pitying tones that were entirely devoid of actual empathy or offers of structural support. He was transformed into a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the periphery of Los Angeles, serving only as a grim reminder to the current crop of young actors of what happens when you fail to navigate the treacherous currents of fame. This total social abandonment is a profound psychological trauma that vastly accelerates the cycle of addiction. When a human being is treated as a societal contagion, when they are systematically stripped of their community, their profession, and their dignity, the narcotic ceases to be merely a chemical dependency. It becomes their only remaining companion, the only reliable entity in a world that has entirely turned its back on their suffering. Trapped within this suffocating vacuum of isolation, Blake's existence fractured into a desperate, endlessly repeating cycle of institutional rehabilitation and catastrophic relapse, a Sisyphean nightmare that consumes the lives of countless long-term addicts. The narrative of recovery as sold by the lucrative rehabilitation industry and celebrated by the media suggests that overcoming addiction is simply a matter of willpower, a linear journey from the darkness of substance abuse into the bright, sober light of a reclaimed life. The clinical neurological reality of opioid addiction is infinitely more complex and terrifying. Decades of heroin use fundamentally alter the neuroplasticity of the brain, aggressively downregulating the natural production of dopamine and endorphins until the brain entirely forgets how to experience joy, satisfaction, or even basic physical comfort without the introduction of the synthetic chemical. When Blake entered rehabilitation facilities, and he entered them repeatedly, demonstrating a fierce, heartbreaking desire to save his own life, he was not merely fighting a psychological habit. He was battling a brain that was actively screaming for survival. The physical detoxification from opioids is a violent rebellion of the nervous system, characterized by bone-crushing muscle aches, tremors, and a panic-inducing anxiety that feels indistinguishable from dying. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms of various treatment centers, stripped of his cinematic legacy and reduced to the raw, shivering reality of a patient in crisis, Blake was forced to confront the colossal mountain of his trauma without the heavy, protective blanket of his anesthetic. He had to sit in group therapy circles, surrounded by ordinary people battling their own demons, and attempt to articulate the incredibly specific, bizarre trauma of being a globally exploited child star, a narrative that very few clinical professionals are genuinely equipped to unpack. Yet despite the overwhelming physiological and psychological odds stacked against him, Blake continually threw himself back into the grueling arena of recovery, a testament to a resilient, deeply buried survival instinct that the industry had failed to completely extinguish. He possessed a desperate, agonizingly clear awareness of his own squandered potential, and he harbored a genuine fading hope that if he could just manage to piece his fractured neurochemistry back together, he might somehow find a way to return to the only profession he had ever truly known. He wanted to act again. He wanted to prove to the executives who had discarded him, to the public that had forgotten him, and, most importantly, to himself, that he was more than just a tragic footnote in the annals of child stardom. He wanted to reclaim the narrative of his own life, but the cruel, inescapable trap of the rehabilitation cycle is that stepping out of the treatment center is often far more dangerous than entering it. Upon discharge, Blake was not returning to a supportive, nurturing environment, insulated from triggers. He was returning to the exact same indifferent city, the exact same shattered career, and the exact same overwhelming memories of rejection that had driven him to the needle in the very first place. The industry does not offer a reinstatement program for its damaged veterans. There is no welcoming committee for a 30-something former child star with a history of severe opioid abuse. The moment the initial fragile euphoria of early sobriety collided with the crushing, unchanging reality of his obsolescence, the brain's desperate demand for relief would return with a terrifying, irresistible vengeance. This devastating loop, the excruciating pain of detox, the fragile, terrifying hope of early sobriety, the brutal collision with an unforgiving reality, and the inevitable crushing defeat of relapse became the defining rhythm of his adult life, a rhythm that systematically eroded his physical endurance and ground his remaining optimism into dust. With each successive failure, the internal reservoir of hope depleted, replaced by a heavy, suffocating mantle of shame. He was forced to live with the excruciating cognitive dissonance of knowing exactly what he needed to do to survive, while simultaneously possessing a brain that was chemically hijacked to prevent him from doing it. He was a prisoner in his own deteriorating body, a man possessing the intellect to fully comprehend the mechanics of his own destruction, but lacking the neurological tools to halt the machinery. The tragic irony is that the very same emotional sensitivity and deep reservoir of empathy that had made his performance in Shiloh so universally resonant were the exact same traits that made him so acutely, unbearably vulnerable to the pain of his addiction. He felt everything too deeply, and in a world that refused to offer him any genuine compassion, the heroin was the only thing that could turn the volume down. As his 30s progressed and his physical constitution grew dangerously fragile, the distance between the brief periods of sobriety and the inevitable returns to the needle began to shrink, accelerating his trajectory toward a physiological breaking point. He was fighting a war against an invisible, relentless enemy on a battlefield completely devoid of allies, armed with nothing but a shattered nervous system and a desperate, fading memory of a boy who had once believed he could save the world. The fragile architecture of early sobriety is perhaps one of the most misunderstood psychological and physiological states in the human experience. A precarious existence where the individual is completely stripped of their chemical armor and forced to navigate a blindingly sharp reality with a nervous system that has been systematically traumatized for decades. For Blake Heron, the late summer of 2017 represented a monumental, desperate bid for survival, a final exhausting push to reclaim his life from the suffocating grip of the opioid epidemic that had consumed his entire adult existence. He had once again voluntarily surrendered himself to the grueling, humbling machinery of an institutional rehabilitation center, a process that requires a level of internal fortitude and psychological bravery that the entertainment industry, which had so casually discarded him, could never begin to comprehend. To enter a detox facility after multiple previous failures is not an act of weakness. It is an act of profound, almost irrational hope. It requires the addict to look directly into the terrifying abyss of their own repeated defeats, to acknowledge the staggering wreckage of their past, and to somehow convince their chemically hijacked brain that this specific attempt will end differently. Blake, now 35 years old, was no longer the defiant, rebellious teenager reacting to the sudden loss of his cinematic crown. He was a deeply exhausted, battle-scarred man who simply wanted to stop hurting. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit walls of the treatment facility, he endured the excruciating, bone-crushing agony of physical withdrawal, a violent biological rebellion where the body screams for the narcotic that has been artificially regulating its central nervous system for over 20 years. He sat in the plastic chairs of group therapy rooms, a former global icon of childhood purity, anonymously sharing his profound specific trauma with ordinary people who were battling their own suburban demons. He stripped away the lingering toxic mythology of the Hollywood child star, actively participating in the unglamorous, repetitive work of dismantling his own psychological defense mechanisms, trying to understand why the boy who had saved Shiloh had grown up into a man who wanted to destroy himself. By all accounts, from those who interacted with him during this period, Blake was not merely going through the motions to appease a judge or a family member. He was genuinely, fiercely committed to the process. He possessed a desperate, palpable hunger for a normal, unremarkable life, a life completely devoid of casting calls, public scrutiny, and the relentless, exhausting pursuit of illicit narcotics. He wanted to be healthy. He wanted to be a functioning, reliable human being. He was laying the foundation for a resurrection, brick by painful brick, building a fragile wall of defense against an industry and a disease that had systematically tried to erase him. When the doors of the rehabilitation center finally unlocked and Blake stepped out into the blinding, unforgiving light of the Southern California sun, he was entering the most critically dangerous phase of the recovery cycle. The transition from the highly regimented, trigger-free environment of an inpatient facility back into the chaotic, unstructured reality of the outside world is a psychological shock wave that shatters the resolve of countless recovering addicts. Blake returned to his home in La Crescenta, a quiet, suburban enclave of Los Angeles that felt light years away from the glittering, ruthless machinery of the Hollywood studios. He was armed with the standard tools of early sobriety, a schedule of support group meetings, a sponsor, and a desperate, white-knuckled determination to fundamentally rewrite the narrative of his own life. The first few days of this new existence are characterized by a profound, almost hallucinatory sensory overload. Without the heavy synthetic blanket of heroin to muffle the environment, every sound is too loud, every light is too bright, and every emotion, from the mundane anxiety of paying a utility bill to the crushing residual shame of his squandered career, hits the unprotected nervous system with the force of a physical blow. He was essentially a man walking through a hurricane without a coat, feeling the icy sting of reality against his bare skin for the first time in years. Yet despite the terrifying vulnerability of this state, Blake was actively doing the work. He was attending his meetings, seeking the camaraderie of other recovering addicts, and trying to establish a quiet, steady rhythm to his days. He was proving to himself that he could exist in the world without the needle, demonstrating a profound resilience that stands in stark, magnificent contrast to the cynical, disposable manner in which the entertainment complex had treated him. He was not a weak man. He was a man fighting a colossal, invisible war within his own neurochemistry. And for a few brief, shining days in September 2017, it genuinely appeared as though he was finally winning. The tragedy that unfolded next is a masterclass in the horrific blind cruelty of biological timing. A turn of events so aggressively mundane and devoid of cinematic drama that it feels almost insulting to the scale of his suffering. Blake Heron was not brought down by a wild, hedonistic Hollywood party, a sudden influx of unearned wealth, or a scandalous, highly publicized industry failure. He was brought down by a microscopic, exceedingly common pathogen. Exactly 3 days after he walked out of the rehabilitation facility, radiating a fragile, hard-won optimism and armed with a genuine commitment to his new sober life, Blake contracted a severe strain of the influenza virus. In the narrative architecture of a Hollywood movie, a common cold is merely a device used to keep a character in bed for a single comedic scene. In the stark biological reality of a recovering heroin addict, a severe flu is a catastrophic, potentially insurmountable crisis. To understand the fatal nature of this illness, one must examine the compromised state of the vessel it was invading. 20 years of chronic intravenous opioid abuse had fundamentally ravaged Blake's physical constitution. His immune system was not a robust, functioning defense network. It was a battered, exhausted shadow of itself, completely incapable of mounting a rapid, effective response to a viral infection. His internal organs, his liver, his kidneys, and his cardiovascular system had all sustained microscopic, cumulative damage from decades of processing toxic, illicit chemicals. When the flu virus entered his body, it did not encounter a healthy, resilient 35-year-old man. It encountered a biological war zone that had just barely survived the apocalyptic trauma of medical detoxification. As the virus multiplied and the illness rapidly escalated, the physical reality of Blake's existence transformed into an absolute, inescapable nightmare. The symptoms of a severe flu, the violent, uncontrollable shivering, the torrential sweating that soaks through the bedsheets, the profound, immobilizing nausea, and the deep throbbing ache that settles into the very marrow of the bones, are inherently miserable for any human being. But for a newly sober opioid addict, these specific symptoms are not merely uncomfortable. They are a source of profound, unparalleled psychological terror. The biological manifestations of the influenza virus are almost neurologically indistinguishable from the horrific, agonizing symptoms of acute heroin withdrawal. As Blake lay alone in his La Crescenta home, his body burning with fever and racked with intense muscle pain, his traumatized brain could not differentiate between a common viral infection and the terrifying, familiar agony of narcotic deprivation. The neurological pathways that had been carved into his brain over 20 years began to misfire wildly, interpreting the physical distress of the flu as a desperate, screaming demand for opioids. The rational, newly sober part of his mind, the part that had sat in group therapy and planned for a healthy future, was suddenly forced into a brutal, unequal combat against the most primitive, survival-driven mechanisms of his central nervous system. He was experiencing a level of physical suffering that most people will never comprehend. Isolated in a quiet house, completely cut off from the medical supervision that had monitored his initial detox just days prior. He did not want to get high. He did not want to throw away the agonizing work he had just completed in rehabilitation. He simply, desperately wanted the pain to stop. He wanted relief from the fever, relief from the bone-deep aching, and relief from a body that felt as though it was actively turning against him. In this moment of supreme physical vulnerability, the insidious, calculating logic of the addicted brain launches its final fatal assault. The mind, desperate for homeostasis, whispers a treacherous, convincing lie that just a tiny fraction of a dose, just a microscopic amount of the drug, will act as a medicine, temporarily lowering the fever and stopping the tremors so the body can finally rest and fight the virus. It is a terrifying rationalization born not of a desire to party, but of a desperate primal instinct to survive an overwhelming physical crisis. For a man who had utilized heroin as a universal anesthetic for every physical and emotional injury he had suffered since childhood, the impulse to reach for the needle when faced with intolerable sickness was a deeply ingrained, almost involuntary reflex. Hollywood had taught him early on that a pill or a substance was the quickest way to stay on his feet and keep the machinery moving, and his addiction had cemented that lesson into his very DNA. The fatal decision to use wasn't a reckless pursuit of a high, nor an abandonment of his hard-won sobriety. It was a desperate, miscalculated reflex by an isolated man trying to survive an overwhelming physical crisis. He didn't want to escape his new life. He simply wanted the agony of the flu to stop. The ultimate devastating mechanism of his death lies in the unforgiving mathematical reality of opioid tolerance, a biological trap that claims the lives of countless addicts immediately following a period of institutional sobriety. For 20 years, Blake's body had built up a massive, monumental tolerance to heroin, requiring him to consume staggering quantities of the narcotic simply to avoid withdrawal and achieve a baseline of normalcy. But the weeks spent detoxing inside the rehabilitation facility had fundamentally reset his internal chemistry. His body was entirely clean, his opioid receptors were vacant, and his physical tolerance had plummeted back down to the level of a complete novice. When Blake, driven by the agonizing pain of the flu and the confusing overlapping symptoms of withdrawal, administered the fatal dose of opioids, later identified as laced with fentanyl, his addicted memory likely dictated the amount. He used a dose that his pre-rehab body might have processed without a second thought, a dose familiar to his long-term habit, but his newly cleansed, fragile, and virus-ravaged body was completely incapable of handling that toxic load. The tragic irony is that his success in rehabilitation is precisely what made his relapse so immediately lethal. The fentanyl hit his system with the force of a freight train, rapidly crossing the blood-brain barrier and flooding the vacant receptors in his brainstem. The drug performed exactly the function he had sought. It instantly silenced the aches, the fever, and the panic of the flu. But it did not stop there. It pushed past the threshold of pain relief and moved directly into the respiratory control centers of his brain, issuing a heavy chemical command to his lungs to simply stop working. The fight for survival, the desperate desire to reclaim his life, and the agonizing battle against the flu all quietly dissolved into a heavy synthetic sleep from which the boy who had once captivated the world would never awaken. The morning of September 8th, 2017, did not arrive with the dramatic weeping skies or the swelling melancholic orchestral scores that so often accompany the cinematic portrayal of a tragic death. It arrived with the blistering, indifferent sunshine and the aggressive, mundane quiet of a typical Southern California suburb. Inside the modest residence in La Crescenta, the air was entirely still, devoid of the frantic, life-saving urgency that the entertainment industry so frequently manufactures for its hospital dramas. There were no cameras positioned to capture the perfect angle of grief, no directors calling for a second take to ensure the lighting cast the appropriate shadows upon the scene. There was only the horrific absolute finality of a biology that had been pushed far beyond its capacity to endure. When Blake Heron's girlfriend opened the door to his home, stepping out of the bright morning light and into the cool, silent interior, she was not stepping onto a movie set. She was walking directly into the grim, unvarnished epicenter of the American opioid epidemic. She found him lying completely motionless on the floor, his body positioned in a way that offered no dignity, no romanticized notion of a peaceful, eternal slumber. The surrounding environment was a devastating tableau of his final desperate hours. The sterile, terrifying paraphernalia of intravenous drug use, scattered indiscriminately, a silent, screaming testament to the violent neurological war that had just concluded within his skull. To find someone you love in this state is to experience a psychological trauma that fundamentally and permanently fractures your understanding of reality. A moment where the brain desperately attempts to reject the visual evidence presented to it. She called the emergency services, her voice likely trembling with the specific, suffocating panic that accompanies the sudden collision with death. But the reality was that the timeline for salvation had expired hours before she had even turned the key in the lock. The boy who had once sprinted across the sunlit fields of the silver screen, whose every movement had been choreographed, ensured, and celebrated by millions, was now a cold, inanimate object, a tragic still life painted entirely in the grim gray tones of a fatal overdose. When the Los Angeles County paramedics arrived, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, they brought with them the loud, chaotic intrusion of official medical protocol. But their presence was merely a bureaucratic formality in a tragedy that had already achieved its horrific conclusion. They carried the medical bags equipped with Narcan, the miraculous opioid-reversing antagonist that has snatched countless addicts back from the very precipice of the abyss. But the drug is a mechanism of revival, not of resurrection. It requires a heart that is still struggling to beat, lungs that are still fighting for oxygen, a brain that has not yet been entirely starved of blood. As they knelt beside Blake, quickly assessing his pupillary response, his skin temperature, and the absolute absence of a pulse, the clinical reality of his condition became immediately, undeniably apparent. The lethal drug had not merely suppressed his respiratory drive. It had completely, permanently extinguished it. The paramedics did not engage in the frantic, prolonged chest compressions seen in the movies, because the physiological indicators of death, the pooling of the blood, the onset of rigor, the chilling drop in core body temperature, communicated a story of a heart that had stopped beating long before the sun had risen. He was pronounced dead at the scene, transforming in a matter of seconds from a struggling, hopeful 35-year-old man attempting to rebuild his life into a forensic subject, a statistic to be logged, cataloged, and transported to the county morgue. This is the absolute unglamorous reality of the disease that Hollywood so frequently attempts to romanticize or ignore. There is no triumphant final monologue, no tearful goodbye surrounded by loved ones. There is only the sudden, violent cessation of consciousness, followed by the clinical, indifferent processing of the human remains. The body of the former child star was placed onto a stretcher, covered with a sterile, opaque sheet that obscured the face that had once adorned magazine covers across the globe, and wheeled out of the house, loaded into the back of a coroner's van that blended seamlessly into the morning traffic. The juxtaposition between the beginning of his journey and its brutal termination is a chasm so vast and so deeply unsettling that it functions as a glaring, undeniable indictment of the entire entertainment ecosystem. We must force ourselves to hold the image of the coroner's van directly alongside the image of the 1996 red carpet premiere of Shiloh, to truly comprehend the staggering human cost of the industry's manufacturing process. At 14 years old, Blake had stood in the blinding crossfire of hundreds of flashbulbs, wearing a tailored suit, surrounded by wealthy, powerful executives who placed their hands on his shoulders and smiled for the cameras, loudly proclaiming him to be the future of cinema. He was treated as royalty, insulated by a phalanx of publicists and managers who fiercely protected their investment. 21 years later, that exact same human being was carried out of a suburban house in a body bag, entirely alone, completely devoid of the protective corporate armor that had once shielded him. The executives who had so eagerly claimed credit for his early success were nowhere to be found when he needed funding for psychiatric care, when he needed a stable environment to detoxify, or when he lay dying on a hard floor. The industry operates with the cold efficiency of a strip mine. They located a resource, the raw emotional vulnerability of a child, extracted it for maximum profit, and when the asset was depleted, they simply abandoned the site. Blake Heron was a depleted mine. His youth, his innocence, and his neurological stability had been aggressively harvested to create wealth for others. And when he inevitably broke under the pressure, the industry did not offer a repair manual. They simply threw him away and moved on to the next available child. In the days following his death, the media landscape briefly reignited. Entertainment outlets, which had largely overlooked his adult struggles, suddenly featured his face across their screens. Studios released carefully curated statements, mourning a tragic loss of talent. However, the complete story of Blake Heron is more nuanced than a simple narrative of defeat. Just months before his passing, in the spring of 2017, he attended the Tribeca Film Festival. He was there to promote 1,000 Junkies, an independent film where he bravely channeled his own struggles with addiction onto the screen. Even near the end, he was actively fighting to rewrite his narrative. The final toxicology report confirmed the lethal presence of fentanyl, complicated by a severe strain of influenza. Medical documents, however, cannot quantify the psychological weight of growing up within the Hollywood machine. Blake Heron leaves behind a complex legacy. He remains forever frozen in the digital amber of 1996, a boy running through the woods, saving a dog. Yet beyond that cinematic illusion, his life and his desperate fight for sobriety stand as a stark, undeniable reminder. It forces us to examine the profound human cost of treating childhood as a disposable commodity.